Morning, everyone. It's good to see this number we have who have decided to put God first in their lives this Sunday morning. I'm always thankful to see that, and I'm sure everybody here is thankful as well. I'm thankful for the opportunity to stand before you once again, to be able to present a portion of God's Word. We're free to study the Bible every day at any time, but being asked to put together a lesson forces you to, come up with the topic and perform a dedicated study. So it's always nice to be able to do that. And hopefully everybody here in the audience today is able to take something from this. We're here to expand our knowledge to God, to make our lives better spiritually, as compared to how we've been living in the past. So hopefully everybody's able to be edified this morning. If there are any questions, don't hesitate to ask me or any member of the audience. And if we will not be able to get you the answer, we'll get you to somebody who knows the answer. So there's one thing that I want to avoid this morning, and that's any cliches. So I don't want to talk about being thankful, and I don't want to talk about Ohio State football. So hopefully you got your thanking and your crying done these last couple of days, and we'll put that beside us. So as you can see by the title slide, I'd like to go through the book of Hebrews this morning. I know this congregation and a couple other congregations that people here have been involved with has done a dedicated study of Hebrews, and I'm sure a lot was learned, but I want to focus on one specific point about the book of Hebrews, something that I think is easily missed whenever you try to go through the fine details of the whole book. And hopefully by the time we all leave here this morning, we have a better understanding of that book. But as you can see, the subtitle that I chose there is Changing a Way of Life. And that's something I want everybody to keep in the back of their minds today, of this is what happened throughout the book of Hebrews. The book of Hebrews was directed to early century Jews, first century Jews, that all they've known their entire life, religious-wise, community-wise, socially-wise, was the old law, was the Old Testament. And the writer of Hebrews basically came along and said, forget all that stuff. We've got new rules. And one thing I want to point out that I thought was interesting whenever I was studying this is I heard somebody else who was doing a separate study on this. Before they said anything, they brought up the fact that the writer of Hebrews is not listed in the beginning of the book, as were much of the letters of the New Testament books. And the fact that this specific speaker brought up is that, he raised the question that maybe there was a reason that writer was never listed. Maybe that was that aspect of ambiguity, that God chose that for some reason. So I just wanted to point that out, maybe spark some thought in everybody's minds. But we'll move on. That's not the purpose of today's lesson. As I said before, it's easy whenever you try to study the book chapter by chapter to kind of get lost in the individual words, especially chapter 11, when it talks about, we always call that the chapter of faith. We can read that and it's easy for us to say that that specific chapter is an exhortation to us as Christians to have faith in what God teaches and what we're supposed to do here on earth, which is true. There's nothing wrong with that statement. But I want to tie that back into what that meant to the first century Jews. And that's what I'm going to nail on this morning. So again, we want to understand that the writer of this book, he's attempting to turn this Jewish audience from everything they know in the old law to the new law. And remember when I said that I don't want to relay any cliches up here, this is my one chance where I get to. So throw that aside for this. But I like to try to keep definitions out of my lesson. But Hebrew, I think, is kind of an easy word for us to say all the time and kind of forget what it means. So I went ahead and threw the definition up there. Hebrew is specifically addressing the members of an ancient northern Semitic people, the Jewish people of the area, that were ancestors of the Jews, essentially. So the Jews of the areas is what the Hebrews are, and that's what we're going to talk about this morning. And then the new law that came along that this writer was talking about, the new law was established by Jesus. And the writer makes multiple comparisons throughout the book. I want to break that up into four main comparisons that we're going to look at today, and understand how the writer was trying to explain to the Jews of the area, the first century Jews, that the old law is now gone and we're now to follow Jesus' teachings in the new law. And again, as we go through this, just try to keep in the back of your mind how difficult this must have been. This was the way of life for the Jews back then. And they're essentially everything is getting turned on its head for them. And try to compare that to your life today and how that would how you would be able to handle that. So let's go ahead and go into our first comparison so we don't waste too much time here. The first comparison that the writer made was between Jesus and the angels. Obviously, the Jews of the time, they had stories passed down from generation to generation, and the angels that was a big hitting point for them, because a lot of otherworldly experiences happened to these Jews' ancestors involving angels. And we're going to go ahead and look at them. As I mentioned here in this point, a lot of the holiest experiences that anybody had ever seen throughout all of history typically involved an angel. So these were very esteemed creatures among the Jews, if that's an acceptable way to denote them. But we're going to go ahead and look at some of these examples if you'd like to follow along. The first one we're going to look at is Genesis chapter 19, and we'll read a couple verses in that chapter. Genesis chapter 19, and we're going to go ahead and read verse 15 through 17, which reads, "With the coming of dawn, the angels urged Lot, saying, 'Hurry, take your wife and your 2 daughters who are here, or you will be swept away when the city is punished.' When he hesitated, the men grasped his hand and the hands of his wife and his 2 daughters and led them safely out of the city, for the Lord was merciful to them. As soon as they had brought them out, one of them said, 'Flee for your lives, do not look back, and do not stop anywhere in the plain. Flee to the mountains, or you will be swept away.'" So this specific set of verses is talking about how 2 angels saved Lot's family from destruction when the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah were destroyed. And some people like to tie those angels into actually destroying the city. If you read down through the verses later on, it talks about how the Lord rained down fire and brimstone. So I didn't really want to include that, but an argument could be made there. But obviously, angels were involved in the scenario of saving Lot from destruction. And the Jews knew about that. That was a story that they had studied and had been passed down. So that's one example of how God's power was relayed to the people of the Old Testament. We're going to look at another quick example in 2 Kings, if you would like to follow along. 2 Kings chapter 19, verses 35 through 36 reads, "That night the angel of the Lord went out and put to death 185,000 in the Assyrian camp. When the people got up the next morning, there were all dead bodies. So Sennacherib, king of Assyria, broke camp and withdrew. He returned to Nineveh and stayed there." And this specific example is talking about how God answered the prayers of King Hezekiah and destroyed the Assyrians. And the specific point I want to pull out of this is the fact that this angel came into a camp and killed 185,000 people. I don't know if anybody here has been in a large crowd scenario. I think the biggest gathering of people I've ever been to is probably about 110,000 in the horseshoe, 50,000 of those people being on the field. If you've ever seen that amount of people in one spot, imagine them all being dead. That's a lot of people to be dead. So that was obviously a miraculous feat that was carried through by an angel. But we'll keep moving on to try to run through these examples. Daniel chapter 3, probably the most compelling example of these three, or most well-known for sure. If you'd like to follow along, we'll read these verses quickly. Daniel chapter 3, verses 19 through 28 read, "Then Nebuchadnezzar was furious with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and his attitude toward them changed. He ordered the furnace heated 7 times hotter than usual and commanded some of the strongest soldiers in his army to tie up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and throw them into the blazing furnace. So these men were wearing robes, trousers, turbans, and other clothes, were bound and thrown into the blazing furnace. The king's command was so urgent that the furnace was so hot that the flames of the fire killed the soldiers who took Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And these three men, firmly tied, fell into the blazing furnace. Then King Nebuchadnezzar, leaped to his feet in amazement and asked his advisors, weren't the three men that were tied up and thrown in the fire? They replied, certainly, your majesty. He said, look, I see four men walking around in the fire, unbound and unharmed. And the fourth looks like the sons of the gods. Nebuchadnezzar then approached the opening of the blazing furnace and shouted, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, servants of the Most High God, come out, come here. So Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego came out of the fire. And the satraps, prefects, governors, royal advisors crowded around them, and they saw the fire had not harmed their bodies, nor was their hair on their heads singed, their robes were not scorched, and there was no smell of fire on them. Then Nebuchadnezzar said, praise be to God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who has sent his angels and rescued his servants. Sent his angel, singular. So this is a very well-known story about how Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they defied King Nebuchadnezzar. They were thrown into the furnace and they were saved by an angel of God from a fire that killed the guys who were throwing them in the fire. So obviously should have been able to kill them if they were inside the fire, but they were saved by an angel. And these stories were known by the Jews. And then we come to this book of Hebrews, where this Hebrew writer is trying to teach the first century Jews of the time. And if we go over to the book of Hebrews and we read verse 6 of chapter 1, we see what he has to say about these angels, the writer. And verse 6 says, and again, when God brings his firstborn into the world, he says, let all God's angels worship him. So obviously, with that statement, we can see that the writer is putting Jesus above the angels in the present, in explanation to these Jews. So generations of these stories being passed down from generation to generation of Jews are now trumped by this statement here in Hebrews where he says, Jesus, who has come to earth, the Son of God, is above these angels, is above everything that you guys know. So that's the first point of comparison that the Hebrew writer makes between Jesus and then the things that were commonly known by the Jews of the time. The second point we're going to look at is Jesus put Moses above, or the Hebrew writer raises Jesus above Moses in the old law practices. So what does this mean to the Jews? Why did the Jews care about Moses? Well, we're going to flip over to Exodus chapter 20, and we're going to read about it. We're going to see what the Bible has to say about this matter. If you'd like to follow along, Exodus chapter 20 and verse 20, and we'll read up through chapter 21 and verse 1. Moses said to the people, do not be afraid. God has come to test you, so that the fear of God will be with you to keep you from sinning. The people remained at a distance while Moses approached the thick darkness where God was. Then the Lord said to Moses, tell the Israelites this. You have seen for yourselves that I have spoken to you from heaven. Do not make any gods to be alongside me. Do not make for yourselves gods of silver or gods of gold. Make an altar of the earth for me. Sacrifice on it your burnt offerings and fellowship offerings, your sheep, your goats, and your cattle. Wherever I cause my name to be honored, I will come to you and bless you. If you make an altar of stones for me, do not build it with dressed stones, for you will defile it if you use a tool on it. Do not go up to my altar on steps, or your private parts may be exposed. Verse 1 of chapter 21 reads, these are the laws you are to set before them. And then you can read throughout the rest of the chapter and see all the items of the old law that were relayed to Moses. And then Moses, after he heard all these things, he relayed these laws to the Israelites of the time. And we could see that there in that bullet point. So that's why Moses is important to these Jews. He's the one who brought the old law to the people. He's the one who received it from God. He went up on Mount Sinai. Everybody else was afraid to go. There's a verse where they say, don't let God come down from the mountain lest we die. And then Moses went up on the mountain himself. So he was the bringer of the law to the people. A very esteemed position for the people of the time. And this is the law that they've been following for centuries. This is what the Jews knew, and this was brought to them by Moses. So obviously a very important character to them. Well, we're going to flip back over to Hebrews, and we're going to see what the Hebrew writer has to say about Jesus compared to Moses. And one point I want to make about the verses in Exodus chapter 20, it had a mention of the fellowship offering, and that's something we're going to talk about later. But try to keep in mind about how these offerings and these acts that the Jews were carrying out daily, how this brought them a sense of community. You know, this was more than just religion to them. This was everything that they knew, as we've been, as is keep being stated. So Hebrews chapter 3, we will read about Moses in the book of Hebrews, if you'd like to follow along. Hebrews chapter 3, starting in verse 1 reads, "Therefore, holy brothers and sisters who share in the heavenly calling, fix your thoughts on Jesus, whom we acknowledge as our apostle and high priest. He was faithful to the one who appointed him, just as Moses was faithful in all God's house. Jesus has been found worthy of greater honor than Moses, just as the builder of a house has greater honor than the house itself. For every house is built by someone, but God is the builder of everything. Moses was faithful as a servant in all God's house, bearing witness to what will be spoken by God in the future. But Christ is faithful as the son over God's house. And we are in his house, if indeed we hold firmly to our confidence and the hope in which we glory." So we see in that set of verses that, again, the Hebrew writer is setting Jesus above what the Jews of the time knew. He said, this new guy that's coming along, the Son of God, is higher than Moses and everything you knew. And another thing I want to point out about this set of verses is the Hebrew writer isn't demeaning anything that the Jews know. You know, he said the old law was what you guys were supposed to follow. You know, the angels were important. Moses was important. Everything that we're going to talk about later in this lesson was important. You know, Moses was a good guy, and he did what he was told to do by God. But Jesus is now the new law. These things are above what was taught in the old law, and essentially trying to convert them over. So we're going to move on to the next point. The writer then compares Jesus to the Old Testament priests. And again, why does this matter to the Jews? Why do they care about the relation between Jesus and the priests of the time? Well, if we turn to Hebrews chapter 9 and verses 6 and 7, we're going to read about it, if you'd like to follow along. Hebrews chapter 9 and verses 6 and 7 read, "When everything had been arranged like this, the priests entered regularly into the outer room to carry on their ministry, but only the high priest entered the inner room, and that only once a year, and never without blood, which he offered for himself and for the sins of the people, that the people had committed in ignorance." So we can see here in these verses that in this specific example, the high priests were the only ones admitted into the most holy place, which we know was a place on earth where God, the Holy Trinity, had been present. And that we can see that in Leviticus chapter 16 and verse 2, which I'll read quickly just for confirmation. Leviticus 16 and chapter 2 reads, "The Lord said to Moses, tell your brother Aaron that he is not to come whenever he chooses into the most holy place behind the curtain in front of the atonement cover on the ark, or else he will die, for I will appear in the cloud over the atonement cover." So we see there that there was holy presence in this area, and these high priests specifically were the only people among all the Jews that were allowed in the area. So these priests were greatly esteemed among the Jewish communities. You know, these people were the Jews' route to God, essentially, under the old law. It was also an exclusive community. Only the people of the tribe of Levi could even, make it in to be a priest. And as we read a lot of these Old Testament examples, we can see that the priests helped carry out all the sacrifices. They were the ones putting the blood on where blood was commanded to be placed. So these Jews were these priests were key to the Jews to follow the commandments of the old law. So now we're going to turn back to Hebrews and see what the Hebrew writer, how he compares Jesus to the priests that these Jews of the time had been following for centuries, essentially. So if you want to turn over and follow along, with me, we'll be reading from Hebrews chapter 7, and we'll read verses 18 through 24. Hebrews chapter 7, starting in verse 18, reads, "The former regulation is set aside because it was weak and useless," talking about the old law. "For the law made nothing perfect." Again, that law is the old law. "And a better hope is introduced, by which we draw near to God. And it was not without an oath. Others became priests without any oath." That's the priest of the Old Testament. "But he became a priest with an oath when God said to him," talking about Jesus here, "The Lord was sworn and will not change his mind. You are a priest forever. Because of this oath, Jesus has become a guarantor of a better covenant. Now there have been many of those priests since death prevented them from continuing in office. But because Jesus lives forever, he has a permanent priesthood." So we can see in these verses here that the writer explains that the oaths that these priests were taking, the practices of the Old Testament priests, those are no longer applicable under the covenants of the new law. And we can see specifically in those last couple of verses that just based upon, the principle of fact that these priests could only serve while they were alive, after they're dead, they can't be a priest anymore. And then we have Jesus under this new covenant, whose priesthood lasts forever. So just based upon that principle, that sets Jesus above the priests of of the old law. And then again, we want to tie this back to what this means to the Jews. Like we said before, these priests were esteemed highly amongst the Jewish communities. So if we have this writer coming in here, we have this guy saying, take these people that you guys put up here, as far as, old law and the commandments of such goes. We have somebody who's even better, which was, unheard of by the Jews. And obviously, not all of them received that well. But that's what we want to understand when we're going through this book, that this is a very difficult thing for the people of that time to understand. So moving on to our last comparison, we're going to talk about how Jesus in the Old Testament practices. We're going to talk about how the practices of sacrificing relate to Jesus and the new covenant. So again, we want to ask ourselves, what does this mean to the Jews? Why is Jesus better than this route of sacrifices? There's lengthy lists in the Old Testament talking about how the Jews are supposed to prepare sacrifices, carry out sacrifices, how the priests were involved, everything that went into the process. And these Jews, even up to this time, they all understood this. They were all taught this from generation to generation. And then we have this wrench thrown in their works. It says all that stuff is gone. We now have Jesus and his sacrifice. So first, we're going to look at what sacrifices meant to the Jews in Leviticus chapter 1. If you would like to follow along, we will read verses 1 through 9. Leviticus chapter 1 and verse 1 reads, "The Lord called to Moses and spoke to him from the tent of meeting. He said, 'Speak to the Israelites and say to them, when anyone among you brings an offering to the Lord, bring as your offering an animal from either the herd or the flock. If the offering is a burnt offering from the herd, you are to offer a male without defect. You are to present it at the entrance of the tent of meeting so that it will be acceptable to the Lord. You are to lay your hand on the head of the burnt offering, and it will be accepted on your behalf to make atonement for you. You are to slaughter the young bull before the Lord, and then Aaron's sons and priests,'" remember what we mentioned about the priest earlier, "shall bring the blood and splash it against the side of the altar at the entrance of the tent of meeting. You are to skin the burnt offering and to cut it into pieces. The sons of Aaron and the priest are to put fire on the altar and arrange wood on the fire. Then Aaron's sons and the priest shall arrange the pieces, including the head and the fat, on the wood that is burning on the altar. You are to wash the internal organs and the legs with water, and the priest is to burn all of it on the altar. It is a burnt offering, a food offering, an aroma pleasing to the Lord." And if you keep reading through that chapter, and a lot of the chapters in the Old Testament, you can see even more rules on the different offerings that they were supposed to sacrifice to the Lord and what they were supposed to do to them. the one thing about this specific set of verses, it talks there towards the end about how they were supposed to wash the internal organs and then they burnt them afterwards. You know, if you're just going to burn them anyways, why would you take time to wash them? But this is how detailed these instructions were for the Jews. This was a very meticulous process, and they were to follow it step by step, and they've been doing it for centuries. You know, if you have a specific tradition within your family or your household that you've been doing for probably just a few generations, you know, given being in America and how old the country is, just think what this meant to the Jews. They've been doing this for a long time, thousands of years. They've been sacrificing these animals that were their only route to God. You know, these sacrifices were their atonement for their sins at the time. So it's common practice, like I mentioned, for all the Jews since the days of Moses to perform these sacrifices, which involved the Jewish community. It involved the priests. You know, what I'm getting at is everybody was doing it, and they've been doing it for a while, and this was engraved into their way of life. So turning away from it had to have been a very difficult thing for them to do. But if we go over to Hebrews again, chapter 9, we're going to see what the Hebrew writer has to say about Jesus in comparison to the sacrifices and the practices of the old law. So Hebrews chapter 9, verses 11 through 14 read, "But when Christ came as high priest of the good things that are now already here, he went through the greater and more perfect tabernacle that is not made with human hands. That is to say, it is not part of this creation. He did not enter by means of the blood of goats and calves, but he entered the most holy place once for all by his own blood, thus obtaining eternal redemption. The blood of goats and bulls and the ashes of the heifer sprinkled on those who are ceremonially unclean sanctify them so that they are outwardly clean. How much more then will the blood of Christ, who through the eternal Spirit offered himself unblemished to God, cleanse our conscience from acts that lead to death, so that we may serve the living God." So we can see here that the Hebrew writer is explaining to the Jews that these sacrifices, the blood of bulls and goats, as said there in the verse, can no longer cleanse you of the sin of your sins. Jesus sacrificed his body, he shed his blood to usher in the New Testament, and that is our route to salvation, was through the sacrifice in the blood of Jesus. So again, tying that back into what that means to the Jews, they've been sacrificing these animals, the top of their herd, for a long time. They've been spreading their blood around, and as the verse said, that was only cleaning them outwardly, but the blood of Jesus is what cleans them inwardly. And this was all said in an attempt to try to sway the Jews of the time to the teachings of the New Testament. So coming in on the last slide here, what I want to focus on is why would we study what's trying to happen here in the book of Hebrews? Why do we care about a guy influenced by God trying to convert these first century Jews from the Jewish religion to Christianity? Well, how I want to tie that question into the lesson is I want to look at probably the most popular chapters of Hebrews, the chapter 11, what we often call the chapter of faith, and chapter 12, to see why this fact is important to us. So if you would like to follow along, we're going to read Hebrews chapter 11, verses 1 through 3, and chapter 12, verses 1 through 3. Hebrews chapter 11 and verse 1 reads, "Now faith is confidence in what we hope for and assurance about what we do not see. This is what the ancients were commended for. By faith we understand that the universe was formed at God's command, so that what is seen was not made out of what was visible." And then turning over to chapter 12, verses 1 through 3, we read, "Therefore, since we are surrounded by such a great cloud of witnesses, let us throw off everything that hinders and the sin that so easily entangles, and let us run with perseverance the race marked out for us, fixing our eyes on Jesus, the pioneer and perfecter of faith. For the joy set before him, he endured the cross, scorning its shame, and sat down at the right hand of the throne of God. Consider him who endured such opposition from sinners, so that you will not grow weary and lose heart. So we see here in these few verses that the writer urges these first century Jews to turn away from everything they know, turn away from what they've been taught. And in chapter 11 specifically, we see that he's telling the Jews that you're going to have some faith. If you're going to turn away from everything you know and follow what I'm telling you is right, it's going to require a lot of faith. If you were asked to turn away from your career path and do something completely different, and somebody tells you it's going to work out right, you're obviously going to be apprehensive. And we can use that as a comparison to how this must have made the Jews feel. But obviously we can see there in chapter 11 that it's going to require some faith. And the writer even pointed out that a lot of your ancestors had this faith. If you go through and read the rest of verse 11, multiple Old Testament characters were pointed out for the faith that they had at the time. And the writer points out that they weren't even alive long enough to see this new covenant ushered in, but they had that faith and they were able to withhold the commandments of God and follow through. And then going into chapter 12, we see that the writer says, push away the sin, push away that everything that is going to hinder you from following this New Testament. Have that faith and do what Jesus commands us to do. So essentially the whole book of Hebrews is the writer trying to show the Jews of the time that Jesus is the route to go. The New Testament is now the binding law, and the Old Testament should be pushed aside. So the last point I want to make, to try to tie this into a edifying lesson for us today, is that if we think about what this whole scenario, how that must have affected the Jews, how hard it would have been for them to, like we've been saying, push everything aside that they've ever known and follow this New Testament. If the Jews of the time were able to do that, we should have nothing in our lives today that are holding us back from following Jesus and doing what he commands us, what we study here every Sunday morning, every Sunday evening, every Wednesday, throughout the rest of the week when we read our Bibles. We have no excuse, essentially. There's no reason for us not to follow Jesus. And there's plenty of other examples. We've got the Jews. There's Gentiles that were able to be converted. We have examples. We have edification. We have commandment directly from God to follow what we are told here in these New Testament books. So I appreciate you listening today. Hopefully that was edifying for all here in the audience. And again, keeping that last point in mind, if you are in the audience and you feel that you have been baptized and you have not been able to follow as Jesus is commanded in the New Testament, we'd be happy to pray for you, whether you make that known when we sing the invitation song or make that known afterwards. Either way, we urge you to do that. And then also, if you have not been baptized, to follow the call of Jesus, we have preparations made behind me to be able to baptize you here this morning. So if you have need for either, please make that known during the invitation song or anytime today, and we will get that done for you as we stand and sing. God calling, yet shall not